Hello, and welcome to Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro, a podcast all about the Bible, theology, and all things related to the Christian faith. I'm the Ryan half of Ryan and Brian, and this is episode number 35. This week we are talking about the nature of truth and testimony in the Gospel of John. Brian shares the necessary components of testimony and how testimony is an adequate means of coming to knowledge. This conversation leads us into next week's episode as well, where we discuss Francis Schaeffer's book, The God Who Was There. Before we get started, if you're enjoying the podcast, would you mind leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or a review on Facebook? If that's not your thing, would you mind sharing the post about this episode or another episode you've enjoyed on Facebook, or just tell a friend? That works as well. We'd love to expand our audience. All right, let's jump into this episode looking at testimony in the Gospel of John.
Hey, Ryan.
Hey, Brian. How are you
doing
today?
well. How you doing, man?
I'm good. I'm really good. It was a great day today. It's a little cold here in Indianapolis. Is it a little cold there?
Yeah, it's like change of seasons.
Yes. Well, it was a very special day in our home.
Yeah?
It was the first day of the season that we have put a fire in the fireplace.
Nice.
We have a fireplace insert.
Yeah,
and
I like a fire in a fireplace.
That's the best place for a fire in a home.
It's cozy. It's warm.
It is cozy. It is warm, and it doesn't burn on the house, like you said. Fall, that's the best place for it.
Fall is one of my favorite seasons. I think it's I like the change. I like starting today. As I was driving, I was looking at all the leaves changing colors and really enjoying that. So it was nice.
Yeah, I was enjoying that until I looked back and there was a slight breeze and like 90 pounds of leaves fell in my backyard.
Well,
so
that's part of the joys of
it's
the season.
Beautiful, yes, but I have a lot of yard cleanup to do here. So anyway, well, we're back here in the bistro.
We are. Very nice.
Yes, no food to talk about today.
Well,
I have water.
I was at Busy Corner for lunch, which you've been to. Ooh. It's a nice place, and maybe we can get a sponsorship. It's in Goodfield, Illinois. The Busy Corner.
I bet you they've been hankering for a podcast sponsorship.
They're busy all the time.
It
It's a great place. In fact, it was funny because I was waiting in line to get seated, and I heard the people in front of them talking, and the one guy's like, "I've been by here a million times. There's always cars in the lot. I've never been before." But and the other guy's like, "Yeah, it's really good." So yeah,
it's the pie, man. The pie.
That's what it's all about. Although I had the fried chicken special today. It was very good.
Oh. It was a special. It was like a quarter of a chicken.
It was
today
2 pieces. So I got the white, which is a breast and a wing, and comes with mashed potatoes, mixed vegetables, and a salad of your choice.
Oh,
of course,
and a salad.
I went with the popular lettuce salad with blue cheese dressing. So
classic.
So we do have food to talk about in the bistro.
Yes, we do have food to talk about. Yes. So I told our listeners last week that we're going to talk about like the reasonableness of faith, and as we were going to talk about Francis Schaeffer's book here in a little bit, but we thought before we even jumped into that, we should talk about something else. What are we going to talk about? I mean, it kind of goes along with it.
It does.
It's a two-parter.
So we're going back to the Gospel of John today. I've been
dun dun dun.
I try not to just be focused on the Gospel of John, but I've spent a lot of time in it, and one of the things that I've spent the most time studying in the Gospel of John is about testimony in the Gospel of John. And the interesting thing, the reason I thought this would be useful for us to talk about in relationship to this idea is it's all related to the way that we come to know things. You ready for me to lay a fancy word on you, Ryan? I know you know this word, but
yes, sure.
We're talking about today epistemology. And epistemology.
I like that word.
Well, it's a cool word. It's how we come to know things. And, it's a kind of a philosophical thing. Like we don't often stop to think about why, when we say we know something, why we can say we know it. What constitutes knowledge is really what it's about. And I think that the Gospel of John is very concerned with this idea of knowing. In fact, there's some ways in which it's very clear that the author is concerned that the people to whom he's writing understand what they know, and or know what they're reading, and so or the truthfulness of it.
And let me ask you this: like with epistemology, even if you've never heard that word, we all have like a framework that we're working in epistemology. That means like everything that we believe, there's like a reason we believe. Like if I sit down in a chair, I think it's going to hold me up.
Yeah. Okay.
Or I don't know. Like I'm just.
Yeah.
We all have
There's three words.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No. This is good. This is exactly. And here's the way I would say it. I should have probably introduced this better. There are three words that we use on a regular basis that are tied up in this idea, and you mentioned a couple of them just then. One of them is belief. Okay. One of them is knowledge, and one of them is truth. How are those concepts related, I think, is part of what we're thinking about. When you say, I know this to be a fact, how did you come to that position of knowing? And here's another thing. You said you believe certain things. What's the relationship between belief and knowledge? And people have been talking about this for a long time, way back to the Greek philosophers. Aristotle was talking about this stuff, the relationship between knowledge and belief. And then the other thing is this, truth, which is very important to the Gospel of John also. You can think of a couple of examples where truth comes in. And what do we mean by truth philosophically? And, here's the thing I'll say, and this is when we're going to talk about Schaeffer's book, he's going to say that truth has really kind of changed its meaning over time. What we mean when we say truth, it shouldn't have in some ways is the point he's going to.
It sent us down a bad path.
That's his point. The point that he's going to make is when we use the word truth today, it's not the same thing that, for example, Jesus meant when he talked about truth. And so I think it's very central to who we are as Christians. It's very central to our beliefs. There's that word again. So anyway, that was kind of what I was interested in when I was working on a PhD in the Gospel of John and thinking about testimony. Let me.
I'm sorry. No. I just want to keep refining words. So when you say testimony in the Gospel of John, you're talking about when the word testimony is John's relating to testimony.
Yeah. So here's the interesting thing. There are three places in the Gospel of John, that the author makes a point to say that I was there and I saw these things for myself. Three different places. I'm going to show you where they are in just a minute if you want. If you quit interrupting me.
Yeah. I do. Oh my!
I'm just kidding, Ryan.
It's a good thing we're not in the same room right now.
Ryan. Yeah, he's like, cut it off.
I'm out of done with this.
So, what I would say, these are examples of what we would refer to as eyewitness testimony. Now, to be clear, the word eyewitness never occurs. There's a Greek word for eyewitness. It's autoptes. It's a fine word. That word never occurs in the Gospel of John. But there are three times that he makes it clear that he was present, the author was present, in order to see the things that he's speaking about. And so he uses this word testimony. I'm going to show you here these three passages, first of all, and then let's talk about witness and testimony a little bit more. Now, the Gospel of Luke uses the word autoptes. You might remember that. Do you remember where Luke talks about that?
No.
In the
I don't.
In the prologue, what we call the prologue of the Gospel of Luke chapter 1 verses 1 through 4, he says that I'm doing this off the top of my head. I wasn't planning on doing this, but as many others have taken up to draw up an account of these things, we thought we would too put these things in order. The things that we have heard from eyewitnesses, there's that word, and ministers of the word. And so he talks about those that he has specifically talked to that have seen these things. And I think we talked about this before, that there's a couple of places where Luke includes material that is unique to him. One of them is Luke 24, where we have the two on the road to Emmaus, and I would make the case that he probably talked to the person. Another is the birth narrative, and some of the things that he says about Mary that we have nowhere else. The Magnificat, for example, some of the things that she says and that she's thinking, we have nowhere else in Scripture, and it makes you wonder: is she one of the eyewitnesses that he's talking about there in that place? At least it makes me wonder that. So, the Gospel of John never uses the word autoptes, but look at John 1:14, for example. I know I told you I was going to start with 21, but look at 1:14 first of all. You want to read that for me, or you want me to?
Yes,
to get it?
I'm there.
Okay. And I'll look at the second one. So this is the kind of the end of what we call the prologue of the Gospel of John. Go ahead.
So John 1:14, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth.
Now, what your translation there translated as seen is sometimes translated as beheld. It's not the normal word for seeing. And so some people have said, well, this is, again, we talked about this before. Some people want to spiritualize the Gospel of John to say that he's really making theological points and not historical points at all. But do you see what he says? We have seen his glory. And so it talks about this idea. And I'll go ahead and say this now. I may repeat myself later. But in the Gospel of John, the words for seeing and knowing are frequently in the plural. They frequently are in that we, instead of I have seen, we have seen. The second one is in chapter 19, verse 35. Now, this is the account of Jesus' crucifixion. And there's a couple of really interesting things. We've talked before about the crurifragium, the breaking of the legs on the cross. We talked about the archaeology, for example, of the Gospel of John. There you have this idea that the thieves and the robber on either side of Jesus' legs were broken, but not one bone of his body was broken. And so it says instead what happens, this is verse 34 of chapter 19, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. The man who saw it, this is verse 35, the man who saw it, or the one who's seen it, has given testimony. You see that word? And his testimony is true. He knows that he tells the truth. There's the word truth. And he testifies so that you may also believe. Those three words we talked about, in fact, testimony and truth and belief are all there contained in that idea. And in fact, knowledge, the word for knowing, is there as well. So you get what I'm saying? I've always said that John is very concerned with epistemology. He wants to make sure not only that you believe things, but you have a solid foundation for your belief. You know why you believe, is kind of his purpose. Now, here's one of the questions. So we have it at the very beginning. That makes sense that we would have at the very beginning the author saying, what I'm about to tell you are things that I have seen for myself. But then we go a long way in the Gospel of John until we get to chapter 19. And then all of a sudden, again, the author
there's another person
inserts themselves into the narrative and says, the one who was there has seen these things and testifies to them, right? And so one of the questions we have is, why here? Why in this particular place? And I studied this question a lot, probably more than anybody else. I should have started off by saying this. I mentioned I was working on a PhD thesis on this. I never completed it, but I was working on a PhD thesis on this. And I always say the most dangerous question in the world to ask is, what's your thesis on, right? Or your dissertation on, because I can talk about this much more than you care to hear about, or any of our listeners care to hear about.
That's good, right? Yes.
But this idea...
Keep it short. This is why I interrupt you.
This idea... Fair point. This idea of right here probably has to do something with the unexpected nature of this event. Now, it could be testifying to the fact that he was really dead. I think it may be that this idea of blood, the flow of blood and water, was an unexpected thing. Now, there's lots of different opinions on this, lots of different debate, but you might remember one of the key verses in chapter 7 of the Gospel of John. We've talked about this before, that Jesus says, from within him will flow living water. And so I think this idea of the disciple testifying that I saw blood and water flow from his side is a significant, it has theological import, but I believe that he is saying, I saw this myself. This is not some fabrication. This is something that I have seen, and I want you to know it.
So you think that's more, I don't know, maybe they're both just important, but like not that Jesus didn't have his legs broken, but also the blood and water?
It could be part of that too. There's lots of different opinions, but yeah, that he was really dead, that he did not, he
have a bone broken,
which he gives a quotation of a scripture about. Obviously, quotes what is it, Deuteronomy 18:18 or Exodus 18:18 is what he quotes there. Sorry.
Yeah, so why do you think, like, the man who saw it has given testimony and his testimony is true? Like, what do you think that's about? Like, the need to tag on to the end of that his testimony
So-
is true. That's, to me, that seems like a weird
Yeah,
tag along. Like,
it could be.
well,
So
I don't know.
I think it has.
Why don't you just say this is my testimony?
We're actually going to talk about this quite a bit, but I think it's he's talking about true testimony. What is it? What is it to have true testimony? And I'm gonna talk about what I understand the three parts of a true witness, true testifier. I think he's setting himself up as someone who can be trusted and is reliable. There have been some, and I think this is more of a modern idea, though. There have been some who said, well, it's almost like he's, what is it? You protest too much. It's like, you can believe,
Yes.
it's like when the kid, I know that your kids,
Oh, and I'm
I'm telling you the
Yes.
truth, right? So,
yeah.
or it can be a verbal tick sometimes, but when somebody says, well, I'm going to be honest with you, I always wonder, so up till now,
Do you lie the rest? Do you lie the rest of the time? If I'm being honest, well, yes.
up to now,
I
everything
appreciate
I've
that.
said is a lie, and now I'm going to tell you the truth. So here's the third time we see eyewitness testimony in the Gospel of John, very end of the Gospel. Again, very beginning of a book, very end of a book, it makes a lot of sense. So this account, you might remember, is where the beloved disciple is following Jesus, and Peter turns around and says, what about him? Because Jesus has just testified that, or has prophesied that Peter is going to die from crucifixion. And so Peter turns around, looks at the beloved disciples, and says, what about him? And Jesus says, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You follow me. And the Gospel of John goes on and says something to the effect of, because of this, people began to spread the idea that this disciple would never die, but that wasn't the point. But then in verse 24, it says this. This is John chapter 21, verse 24. This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. So you see, he's claiming to be the author here. The beloved disciple is claiming to be the author, and he testifies to these things. We know, there's that plural knowing, we know that his testimony is true. There again, you could ask that same question there. And I think, again,
Right, exactly.
the reason he's giving it is to give veracity. He's saying, you can trust the things that I have said to you.
Interesting.
Yeah, and let me go ahead and say this. So here, I believe that the author identifies himself as the beloved disciple, and that hasn't happened at this point. We actually should probably do a whole different episode on the beloved disciple. But I'm going to tell you, I'll go ahead and give away the ending of that episode now. So if you're a faithful listener, you don't have to wait.
Yeah.
But the beloved disciple occurs, and there's this, sometimes it's called the other disciple, or there's this unnamed disciple that appears at certain times in the Gospel of John as a character. And when I say character, you understand, I believe he's a real person, but when we think about
Right.
the narrative, I do
The story.
Yeah, when you think about the story, he occurs as a character, and he occurs at times where you might wonder how the author got access to the information that he's sharing. You see what I'm saying?
Right. There's an inside scoop.
And so
here.
I think the beloved disciple serves this kind of epistemological purpose really throughout the gospel. When somebody might go, now how did he know that? He's saying I was there. So I'll give you one example. The beloved disciple is mentioned when Jesus is on trial, and it says that he was known to the to the guard and was allowed into the inner courtyard. So he's able to see the events of Jesus' trial right there. And so there's an example. There are other places that he's mentioned as well, but that's just one that came to mind. So I want you to look at one more thing on this verse 24 before we leave. This is chapter 21, verse 24 again. I'm going to read it one more time. This is the disciple who testifies. Now that is a verb. This idea of testimony is what we're really talking about today. That's the verb form of this word for idea of seeing, and we'll talk more about what it means in just a minute. I'll give you the Greek here is martireo, and I'll tell you why that's significant in just a minute. And it says he wrote these down, and we know that his testimony, that's the noun form. So testify is the verb form, martireo. Testimony is the noun form, that's martyria. And we find both of these things here in this one verse. Now, the reason I wanted to point to that is just to kind of show you how significant this idea of testimony is in the Gospel of John. That word martyria or martyreo, the idea of the one who is the witness is martyria. martyr, or it could be martus, and that's where we get
Okay,
our.
wait.
That's where we get
You're losing me here.
That's where we get our word martyr. That's the only reason
Okay.
I was gonna point that out. Is
Okay.
the idea of witnessing or testimony is becomes the idea of martyr. And when we talk about a martyr, we're talking about somebody who dies for their faith. In the book of Revelation, martyrs are a big deal. And it's those who've held to the testimony, those who have refused to recant, if you will, their testimony, and as a result, they've died. So that's martyr, not in the Gospel of John, but later comes to mean someone who dies for their faith. But
So testimony and martyrdom go
hand in hand,
go really close.
because they've remained true to their testimony. Now, before we get too far, So the verb form martiretta, and I always talk about when we're doing Bible study, we look at words that are used frequently by an author in order to understand a theme, right? So the word martiretta, and you could do this in your Blue Letter Bible, the online if you want to do that, or you can do this in using a Strong's Concordance if you want to do it that way. The verb form of martiretta, when we look at the Gospels, it occurs one time in the Gospel of Matthew. Never occurs in the Gospel of Mark. It occurs one time in the Gospel of Luke, and it occurs 32 times in the Gospel of John.
A little bit of a uptick in the word usage.
So
there.
you see what I'm saying? It's clearly an important theme. When we get to the noun form martyria, the word testimony, that occurs 3 times in the Gospel of Mark, never occurs in Matthew, occurs one time in Luke, 14 times in John. So between the verb form and the noun form, it occurs 46, 47 times in the Gospel of John that we have some form of this verb or this word to testify or testimony, something to that effect.
And you think that is because John is really trying to drive home the point that this was seen,
yes, I think
and spoken about, like that this is.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
and that's
here's what I think he's saying is that testimony is a valid means to knowledge. I think that's the central theme to the Gospel of John, that you can come to know something by testifying. Let me say this before I get too much further. In English, we use 2 different word groups to talk about what is one word group in Greek, and so we're going to use the words witness and testimony kind of interchangeably. To witness something or to testify to something would be the same word in Greek, and so he's saying this is a valid means to come to knowledge, and this is where this relates to this idea of how we come to knowledge is what I would say.
Epistemology.
Yeah. So. Any questions to this point? I'll say something here. I know.
No,
we're in the deep end.
This is good.
We're in the deep end.
No, but this is good. Just a recap that testimony, and I think maybe sometimes testimony gets a bad rap for us,
yes.
or we look at it with suspicion sometimes. But that testimony in the Gospel of John is a valid way to know something is true.
I would say it is a valid means to know something inside or outside of the Gospel of John. Let me ask you, let's talk just about epistemology for just a minute. And again, I said we don't often think about how we come to know something, how you can say, what would be something you say you would know, Ryan? Give me an example of something you know.
I know
with certainty
that for certainty.
Okay.
Oh gosh, this is going to get very philosophical.
Yes.
I am here. I am having this conversation. I'm saying these words.
Okay, so you can know something about yourself, and that's There was a pretty famous philosopher named Descartes who was trying to say, "What can I get to the basis of all knowledge?" And he said this very famous thing: "I think, therefore I am." Right? But
didn't he also say, like, at some point we didn't know if we were just like a brain in a jar sitting somewhere?
I don't remember that, but
the Cartesian dream or something.
Yeah, but I think there's some problems with his philosophy, but there's a fallacy to it. But because for one thing, we're not in isolation; we're in community. But beside that, I mean, let's not get too far down that road.
Yes.
But what we get is there are some people who will say, I can only know those things that are directly accessible to my senses. And that's kind of what you're saying. I can only know things that my hands have touched or That maybe sounds like a character in the Gospel of John. Things that I have seen for myself, or that my hands have touched, or that I have felt myself. Those are the only things that I can truly call knowledge. Now, here's what I would say: if that is true, and technically this is kind of called solipsism. If that is true, there's a very limited set of things that we can say that we know.
Right.
And yet there are all kinds of other things that we call knowledge. I before we started the podcast, I said, you've never been to Kenya, but you would say you know that it exists. Right. And you know that it exists because you have been told about it. Maybe you've met somebody who's been there, right, and has told you about it. Or we might say things like, now you might say, I've seen Jupiter in a telescope or whatever, but I know there's a planet called Jupiter. There's all kinds of things that we have been taught by someone else, that we've been told. And that's where testimony comes in, I think.
It's been testified to us
yes.
that this is a reality.
Yeah, we have been given testimony about the reality of something, and so I think that's where this becomes pretty important in the Gospel of John. Then, so when you think philosophically about the nature of testimony, and I would say that something like 90% of what we know or more has come from testimony, things that you would call knowledge. Now, I would say it's changed a little bit in this modern era because we have things like cameras, and we have things like video cameras and that kind of. That's what you do for a living, right? And of course, now we've entered a very interesting place because
deep fakes.
We have these deep fakes, and
that's scary stuff.
Can your eyes believe what they see? Even if you see for yourself. Can you believe this to be true? So you can see, I think it's an important thing for us to talk about and to think about. When I say I believe something, what do I mean by that? Why do I believe it? When I say I know something, why can I say I know something, and how do I come to that knowledge? When I say something is truth, what's the relationship between belief and truth, for example? Lots of other things to go along with this as well. Comments to that point or questions?
Well, I mean, I have a lot of things, I'm sure we could talk about, but probably not appropriate. I mean, it's appropriate for the podcast,
sure.
But we would go down rabbit trails for ad nauseum.
Well, let me talk about what I believe to be, or I understand to be, the nature of testimony. So there's a lot of people who've written about this. A couple of the big ones that were very influential on me there's a philosopher by the name of Robert Audi, and he talks about testimony as a valid means to coming to knowledge. His book's called Epistemology. And then, interestingly enough, and then there's another guy named C.A.J. Cody that was very influential with me in this. But I would say, just to simplify it as much as we can, there are three parts to a true witness, to a valid testimony.
Okay.
The first is, if you're going to witness something, if you're going to testify to something, you have to have access to that event. You have to have seen it. Okay, so let's use just a common example today where we might use the word witness. Let's say you're out and about in Indianapolis there, and you see a traffic accident, Ryan. You are there and you see it for yourself. You might be called into a court of law in order to give testimony, right? And you're sworn in, and you're sworn to tell the truth, nothing but the truth, right? Mm-hmm. And so you testify to that. Now, here's an interesting part of this, and I didn't really mean to talk about this, but there have been studies done on eyewitness testimony and the fact that people, even different people from different vantage points, can have vastly different perceptions of what they have seen. So you might have testimony. So for one of the common examples is like, when you see a traffic accident and then later you're asked about the color of the car, there might be two different answers given. Now, here's what I would say in regard to that, though, is what you're not denying is the central point, that there was an accident, right? That sometimes these very traumatic things, we don't get everything else around it, but we certainly remember the primary thing that we saw, right?
Yeah, is this kind of like the tunnel vision? You know, like
I think
if you
so.
see like a police officer that's like something's happening and they can't see peripherally
Right.
what's happening, but they remember they can only see a certain portion. They can't
Because your
our brain
attention,
can't process
your
all of it.
attention is drawn to that, I think, and that's it's a traumatic thing sometimes, and that's what you're focused on. But I think it's related to that. So
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because
Yeah.
that was one of my concerns as we talk about this. Is like that when I said like testimony can kind of have a bad rap, is
Yeah.
sometimes people get put on a stand and they're like,
False-
hey, I saw this, but they miss details.
false perception and that kind of thing. But again, I don't think what's being denied is the primary, that.
Yes.
And so we'll talk about, for example, in Jesus' death, right? That here is a person I knew being crucified is going to be something that's going to be remembered, right? That's going to be a central part of that. So
eyewitness.
yeah, well, have access to the events. They see the event.
Yeah.
The second thing is, now here's the interesting thing about testimony is when you're a witness, it also has to do with speech. So if you testify, it's about something you're speaking. So you saw it, but you're also telling about it. So to be a true witness, you can't keep it in, right?
Right.
To really be a witness, you have to speak about what you have seen. So that's where the beloved disciple, for example, says, I wrote these things down. I'm telling you about the things that I saw. Well, I'll give you an example of John the Baptist a little bit later, and you'll see that same thing there with him. So it's not only perceiving it, but it's also then speaking about it. But here's the third thing that I think is interesting, and this was really from C.A.J. Cody that I got this. We need to the person who's testifying has to be adequately able to understand the event. So I'll give you two examples. So we mentioned the car accident. Imagine if the person who was there was someone who came from a very primitive culture that had never seen an automobile before. Right. And that the first time they ever saw an automobile, now that'd be pretty traumatic too, I guess, but they saw this accident. Now, if they were called as a witness, they might have a difficult time explaining what it was that they actually saw. Cody used this example, which I thought was really interesting. He said, if you have someone who's a trained anthropologist who understands a particular culture, and you're there with that person in a how do I say this, in a culture that is very different than yours, and you both see the same ceremony being performed, right?
Okay.
Now, I could, not trained as an anthropologist, I could tell kind of what I have seen, but an anthropologist who understood that culture and understood the significance of that ceremony would be able to give a better testimony regarding what he had seen. I might be able to say, well, they took out this red yarn and they did this with it, and they cut it and all this kind of stuff. I didn't know what it was about, but the person who'd studied that culture would have a better understanding. And we've all been probably in that kind of a setting or a situation. Sometimes we might be I'm going to use the term expert, right, or the person who has adequate knowledge in order to explain the event that we've seen. Other times we may be with someone who's the expert. Have you ever been in that kind of situation where someone's able to
where I'm not the expert,
right?
That's a lot of situations.
But
like this is a podcast where I am absolutely not the expert.
But you get what I'm saying is sometimes you see something and you're like, I don't really understand everything that's going along. And then someone comes along and explains it to you. And you're like, oh, okay, I get it. I get what was happening. We could probably all think of times where we've had that happen. So John, I think, in his use of testimony is making a point that a true witness has access to the events. I mentioned the beloved disciples, one of the ways that he makes that point. I was there. I saw these things for myself. Also is willing to speak about it. Let's actually look now at John chapter 1.
Okay.
This is John the Baptist. Interesting thing about it is John the Baptist is never called the Baptist in the Gospel of John. That title that's used for him doesn't ever occur, but what he's often referred to as is the one who is testifying. So look at verses 6 through 8 here of John chapter 1. So it talks, we have this big opening, where it says in the beginning, the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word came, and this idea that the light has shone in the darkness has not overcome it. So go ahead and read verses 6 through 8 there for me, if you would.
Yeah. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light.
So isn't that interesting? He came as a, notice those two words at the very beginning. He came as a witness to testify. So those are those two forms of that word, martireo and martyria, right there side by side. Is a very emphatic kind of statement. He came as a witness to testify. He came as a witness to witness is basically what he's saying. A testifier to testify, however you want to put that. So that through him all might believe. So this idea that you can come to true faith through the testimony of another. Now, if you skip down to let's go to verse 32. There's other times that he's talked about testifying here. Then John gave this testimony. I saw the Spirit come down from heaven as a dove and remain on him. Here's what's interesting. In the other Gospels, we all have this account of Jesus' baptism, right? Mm-hmm. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's told as a narrative. In the Gospel of John, it is told as testimony.
Interesting.
John says, I saw, do you see what it says? I saw the Spirit come down from heaven as a dove and remain on him. I myself did not know him, but the one who sent me to baptize with water told me, here's the idea that he's adequately able to explain this as well. The man on whom you see the Spirit come down and remain is the one who will baptize with the Holy Spirit. So you see what I'm saying? He is the one he's like that anthropologist, right? When I saw this happen, the God, the one who had sent me to baptize, had told me the one who you see doing this is going to be the one who baptizes with the Holy Spirit. And then it says this in verse 34, I have seen, okay, there's that idea of having access to it, and I testify. That's the idea of speaking the truth that he has seen, that this is God's chosen one. So isn't it interesting that instead of telling it as a narrative, John chooses to tell it instead. The author of the Gospel of John, who I believe is a different John than John the Baptist, but that's another story.
John, doctor.
That John chooses to give us this as testimony. And it kind of sets us up, I think, for the way that the rest of the gospel unfolds in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm really glad you're pointing this stuff. I mean, I'm glad you're always pointing stuff out to us,
right?
Not just today, but just the thinking about the three other gospels as narrative, and this is a testimony, and to see. It's easy to, again, I've said this multiple times in this podcast, to read. To look at Scripture and miss some of the nuance and the change in that, and just the power of testimony here, and seeing that this perspective from John, who's baptizing Jesus, and I like the analogy, the anthropologist that's helping us understand what's going on here, and that it is true. Like, help us understand what just happened.
Yeah,
the
significance of it, you might say.
Yeah. Otherwise, it's just a thing that happens and we don't really know. We have no way to interpret it. It's a foreign language.
So I would encourage you, read through the Gospel of John with kind of your mind set on this idea of testimony, and you begin to see it everywhere. Not only in the words testimony and witness and these kind of things, but also in the action itself. I think I've talked about this before. In John chapter 9, you have the blind man, and it's very interesting that this is the blind man that Jesus puts the mud on his eyes and sends him away to wash. So he's healed at a distance. And I think that happens very intentionally because he has never seen Jesus. And yet he comes back, and I'm going to use the word, he testifies about who Jesus is, about his identity. So the irony there, I think John's getting at, is here's a blind man who is a better witness to who Jesus is than the people who've seen him in themselves. And of course, that's the one that ends in the gospel. In John 9 is where Jesus says, "I came so the seeing will be blind, and the blind will be seeing, and the seeing will be blind." And the Pharisees are like, "Oh, are we blind?" And he's like, "You said it." So it's that kind of an idea that has to do with testimony. So he's a genuine witness. He's a true witness without ever having seen Jesus. Is the irony there? I think.
Wow. And when you point that out, I mean, it makes the rebuke all the more scathing.
Exactly. exactly.
I mean, all the more scathing to them of like, hey, this guy's never seen me.
And
You've
yet,
seen me.
right?
Oh my gosh.
So here's
This is good. This is good. Bringing it.
Here's the last one, and this is really where I think testimony has to do with the purpose of the Gospel of John. So I call this, we can call this the purpose statement of the Gospel of John. It's John chapter 20, 30 through 31. It's a very famous passage. We've referred to it in various times throughout this podcast, I know. I'll go ahead and read it. It says, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples. And we've talked about that they were there where they could see them, right? Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So he's saying, these have been given so that you can come to this true faith. You have reason to believe. Reasonableness of faith, I think, is the words that you used for kind of what we're talking about, in these couple of podcasts here. So he says, this. Now, here's what's interesting is we often separate that out from what came before it, and I think it belongs with what came just before that. Do you remember what happens just before that purpose statement?
Oh, that's Doubting Thomas.
It's what we call Doubting Thomas. Now, I've said to you before, he shouldn't be called Doubting Thomas. He's Unbelieving Thomas. The word for belief or faith is pistuo. That's the verb to believe. And he is called, it says he is apistuo, right? He's unbelieving. So let's go back and let's read that passage and think about it a little bit. Because you might remember the thing that has happened is that Jesus appeared to the disciples, but he was not present. Thomas was not present. And so, verse 24, this is John chapter...
Out getting a soda or something.
What's that?
Out getting a soda or something to drink.
Well, I have my opinions about it, but we can talk about that another time. John chapter 20, 24. Now Thomas, who's also called Didymus, which, by the way, means the twin, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, we have seen the Lord. Now, what is that?
Testimony.
They said, we were there, we saw the Lord, and now they're telling Thomas. So they are testifying to what they have seen. Now, is that an adequate reason to come to believe? I would say yes, okay? But here's what he says. He's like many people today. He said, unless I see the nail marks in his hands, in other words, unless I see for myself with my own two eyes, and put my finger, unless I touch where the nails were, and thrust is literally the word, my hand into his side, here's what he says, I will not believe, and in fact it's an emphatic form, I will never believe is the way that I often translate this. Unless I can see it for myself, I will never believe. So that's an interesting kind of thought that, here's kind of the way I explain it. If you're in a building, even if there's something, and fair enough, if you've seen Jesus die, to believe in the resurrection is a pretty remarkable thing, right? Resurrections are not something that we see every day. We're not used to the idea of resurrection. It's an unusual event. So what would be an unusual event to you, Ryan, today?
An unusual event for me?
Something that would be hard to believe.
The sun coming up in the west.
Okay, sun coming up in the west. I was going to use the example of unicorns. That's what I usually use. But let's say that you're in a building and a friend of yours comes in and says, you're not going to believe this, but I just saw the sun come up in the west. Okay, now, knowing your friends like me, you're probably assuming they're making fun of you somehow or playing some kind of a trick.
Yes.
But imagine if a couple of your friends come and tell you the same thing. We have seen the sun rise in the west, or we've seen a unicorn, or three of your friends. Imagine if 10 of your closest friends come to you and say, we have seen the sun rise in the west. Okay, now that would be a very difficult thing to believe, but if these are 10 of your closest friends telling you this, and let's, for the sake of the argument, let's imagine that they're not pulling a trick on you. Okay? So that's the situation Thomas finds himself in here, right? 10 of his closest friends that he spent the last however many years of his life, if we believe in a 3-year ministry of Jesus, the last 3 years of his life with these guys, traveling everywhere, sharing meals, sleeping out in the open, just being together for 3 years with Jesus. And 10 of them, and again, they should know Jesus, right? It's not like, oh, we mistook him for somebody else. These are people who've spent time with Jesus, and they come and they tell him, we've seen him raised from the dead. And he says, I will never believe unless I see it for myself. Now, here's the rest of this story. A week later, his disciples were in the disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them. By the way, earlier it says that they were locked for fear of the Jews. Of the Jewish leaders is how we understand it. It's Judaioi in the Gospel of John. So Thomas not being with them actually says something about him, I think. If the other 10 are locked behind locked doors for fear of the Jewish leaders and Thomas is out there, I think it's the same thing we saw earlier when Jesus is going up to Jerusalem and they're like, Jesus, if you go up to Jerusalem, they're going to kill you. And Thomas says, well, we might as well go with him and die with him. So it says a week later, his disciples were in the house again. Thomas was with him. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them, said, peace be with you. Then he said to Thomas, put your finger in the nail marks in my hand. Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and thrust it into my side. And then he says this, and this is the NIV translation, stop doubting and believe. Again, what he says is stop being disbelieving or stop unbelieving and believe. And Thomas said, my Lord and my God. Then I want you to listen to what Jesus says. Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. So how can you believe without having seen? Testimony. And then immediately we get 30 and 31. Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciple, which are not recorded in this book, but these are written so that you may believe. So you see what's going on here is I think he's saying Thomas had adequate reason to believe, and yet he said, I will not believe until I see myself. But then John, if you will, or the beloved disciple, turns to the reader and says, but I have written these things. In other words, I've testified to these things so that you may believe, and by believing you may have life in his name. He's saying you have adequate reason to trust the things that you've heard in this book. And I think that's the reason this Thomas narrative, and this story is only in the Gospel of John. I think that's why we have that story there in that place. And I think 30 and 31 should not be separated. Most modern translations will give you a paragraph break there. Or a section break actually.
Yep.
And I don't think it should be broken. I think it's a part of the same narrative. In fact, I could show you one earlier in the Gospel of John where the same thing happens, where there is no break. Almost exactly the same kind of a thing. So here's what I'm saying, is that John is very concerned with what it means to come to true faith. He's concerned with what we call knowledge. And I think what he's saying is that testimony is a adequate means to come to knowledge. That's really the point that he's making with this theme. This is a central theme in the Gospel of John.
Interesting. And I think this is, I think this is one of the questions, and I think you kind of alluded to this is like, someone asks you, why do you believe?
Yeah.
It's one of those questions. Well, I don't know. Yeah. Maybe I know. I don't know. You know what I mean? Like it comes down to like, it's that foundation, the epistemology. And John is saying here, like these are eyewitness accounts. I've written them down so you might have, know that you're not going to be Thomas.
Yeah.
You're not going to be able to thrust your hand in his side, but all these things have been written so you have a foundation for your belief.
These things were seen by the people who were with him. These signs is what John calls them, point to who Jesus is. They're recorded. I think that's what he's getting at really with this. Is there's really good reason for us to believe. I think it was C.S. Lewis who said this, that well, I know others have as well. I'm not going to attribute to him. All kinds of things are falsely attributed to C.S. Lewis. But it's been pointed out before that you have these people who end up dying for their faith. We understand, you can see some examples of it in the book of Acts even, but we believe these disciples who were with Jesus gave their life for this, and they maintain this testimony to the very end. This is one of the things that John talks about in the book of Revelation. And so what reason would they have not to recant? Why would they continue to remain firmly adamant that these are the things that they saw for themselves? I think it's a good reason for us to believe the accounts that we have in the Gospels. So one of the reasons, not the only reason, but I think it's a good reason for us to believe.
Yeah, and I like that. Yes, absolutely, and I like the connection you made to the martyr thing. I read a book recently about early church martyrs, and they were given the opportunity to recant what they were, and one of the stories was this guy was older, and he's like, he was well loved, and like, just say it, and he's like, no, I will not, and he was killed for it, but then how that was a turning point for that city because people saw that and he held on to his testimony of who Jesus was. Yeah. So, I mean, I know that's a different.
You were saying no. It's a good example. Then, and that's what this idea of the witnesses, the two witnesses in the Gospel of John, are the two martyrs. I mean, they're if you remember the Book of Revelation, they're killed. Their bodies lay in the streets, and people celebrate, and then they raise from the dead, and they become examples of what it means that. They've remained true to their testimony. That's in the Book of Revelation. So, anyway,
and that testimony can equate to truth, and and truth can be sometimes we've talked about that, and we'll talk about that a little bit with Schaefer. That truth can be some. It's becoming harder to know.
Yeah,
or
even Pilate, says what is truth, and Jesus, of course, his statement is, "I am the way, the truth, and the life" to his disciples, and. So I think that word truth is a very important one. Yeah.
All right. So what? We're going to get down to his. We kind of rambled philosophically on this. Like, so what? Like, well, I mean, it's like, hey, let's do a 45-minute podcast and talk about the nature of truth.
I think that we often don't think carefully about it's what you said. Why do we believe the things that we believe are true? And I think examining the. As Christians, there's good reason for us to believe. I think we could sometimes even be cowed when people begin to say, "Oh, you have no reason to believe the things that you believe," or that doubt is more reasonable than faith, or unbelief technically is more reasonable than belief. I think there are good reasons, there are adequate reasons for us to believe, and I think when we really begin to think about the reason that we know anything. We begin to see how dependent we are on the testimony of others. You mentioned history before we started the episode today.
All history is testimony.
Exactly, and so that idea: how do we know anything about any historical figure? There's very little that we can show archaeologically, for example, but we have the Thucydides, we have Aristotle. Julius Caesar, of course, wrote eyewitness accounts of his wars and this kind of thing. So some of these early historians, Josephus is another example. Part of what I've looked at is the way that they use testimony as well, and the way that they insert themselves into the narrative and these kind of things. And so, it's a way that we come to know. I'll say this that. And we can talk about this some later, but this idea of having a radical, how do I put this? A radical suspicion. And I'm not saying let's accept every testimony, with unquestioning, without questioning it. But to be radically suspicious, I think, puts us in a very difficult position to know anything. When we begin to say, "Oh, you have to doubt everything you've ever been told," that puts you in a very untenable place, and so that's part of this whole question about how we come to this idea of not only faith but also knowledge.
Yeah, it's hard when you place a cynicism on everything you hear to like know anything, and then if you don't believe anything, or if you can't believe anything, anything is possible, and you create a whole nother whole nother thing.
I think we live in a time, and there are things going on around us in the culture where we don't think carefully enough about epistemology, about how we come to knowledge, and I think it's important that we begin to examine this and think about it a bit.
Yeah, very good. Well, correction. you have waxed philosophical on some of the stuff, and I've just kind of listened and asked some random questions. But this is a little bit more, philosophical to think about the nature of truth,
Sure.
and that testimony in John is can be a accurate. I'm not saying the right words.
That's fine.
It's a foundation for truth.
I think so.
And knowledge, and
adequate means to come to knowledge.
Yeah, and I think we're going to talk a little bit about Francis Schaeffer's book here in a little bit, and that talking about the nature of knowledge there as well, and how do we know what we know. It all wraps up together anyway. So. Well, Brian, thank you so much for sharing your information and your knowledge on testimony in the Gospel of John. And we'll do it again soon, huh?
Sounds good. I'll see you soon.
All right, see you. Bye. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. Next week, Brian and I are talking more about truth through the lens of Francis Schaeffer's book, The God Who Was There. Schaeffer helps us think about the consequences of separating ourselves from the concept of truth that is found in God. We hope you'll join us for that. You can find show notes, links, and more at thebiblebistro.com, as well as sign up for our email newsletter to stay in touch. You can find us and follow us on Facebook and Instagram at The Bible Bistro. And as always, you can subscribe to us on either Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Just search for Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you next Tuesday.